On this episode of Public Research with Daniel Schwartz, a rising right-wing star with billionaire backers is unmasked as a prolific writer for several racist and anti-Semitic websites. Today, the story of Richard Hanania with Jonathan Katz, author of the Racket Substack.
How did Richard Hanania come on your radar in the first place?
Twitter. He was just a guy on Twitter, for years. I would encounter him, and people responding to him and getting into Twitter fights with him. And he would just say like off the wall racist stuff. And I honestly didn't really pay him a ton of mind because I was like, oh, it's just a racist guy on Twitter. It's like, it must be a day ending in Y, right? Like I said, that happens all the time. And, the thing that got him a little bit more of my attention, and I think, other people's, is that he's erudite. He would try to sort of make these kind of intellectual sounding arguments, but he would just say like dumb, hateful shit. So I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to him. What got my attention in a way that I decided to actually write about him was that he appeared on Substack's flagship podcast, The Active Voice. And Hamish McKenzie, who is one of the co-founders of Substack, was interviewing him. So I found it on the Twitter competitor Substack Notes that there was this podcast episode. I was like, you're having on Richard Hanania? Like, what? What? And I listened to it, and it was just such a gentle, yes and kind of conversation, which ended with Hanania, Hamish McKenzie asking Richard what other Substack writers he recommends, and he recommended Steve Saylor, who actually Hamish brought up first. Steve Saylor is a notorious white supremacist.
Is he on Substack?
Yeah.
Oh,
pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I can tell you that Hanania recommended him. I'm pretty sure he was recommending a Substack. Somebody who is definitely on Substack, who Hanania recommended, is this guy Emil Kierkegaard, who's a real piece of work, Danish German ethno-nationalist, as he calls himself. Got made waves even in his community for basically literally recommending, like, trigger warning here, but like recommending child rape. Like he had this suggestion that like you could like rape children as long as you drug them first. It was crazy stuff. And Hanania is like, oh yeah, this guy, Emil Kierkegaard is like definitely somebody worth listening to.
He thinks outside the box.
He's hard to pin down. He's asking the big questions. And he is a just a hateful guy in general. And and Hamish, who I know, I mean, I actually don't think we've ever met in person, but I've been writing on Substack for 4.5 years. It was Hamish who personally, reached out to me. I set up an account without, planning on really posting anything in 2019. And Hamish saw that I had and reached out to me, and we had like a number of phone conversations in which he personally encouraged me to get involved, and, promised an open line to Substack management, which was an easy thing to promise in those days because Substack was a much smaller game than it is now. And I was just like, how this guy who's just like insane, like racist Twitter troll, is getting, this velvet glove treatment on Substack's flagship podcast. Like, what's up with that? And so I was just like, well, I'll get a newsletter out of that. I'll write about who this guy is. And it was in doing that I really started digging a little bit more into who Richard Hanania is and what's behind him.
Just to give people an idea of some of the stuff that he tweets. This is a tweet from Richard Hanania. I don't have much hope that we'll solve crime in any meaningful way. It would require a revolution in our culture or form of government. We need more policing, incarceration, and surveillance of Black people. Blacks won't appreciate it. Whites don't have the stomach for it. So that's what he was. That's what he was tweeting under his own name.
That was this year.
So you start looking into his organization. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I look, I'm a reporter. I have just like reporter muscle memory. You know, when I'm writing a piece about somebody, I just start looking for information about them. Who is this guy? You know, what sort of organizations is he affiliated with? And in Hanania's Twitter bio, he identifies himself first and foremost as I think the title he gives himself is president, but that he's the head of this think tank, the Center for Partisanship, or Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. And you know, I've done a lot of reporting on nonprofits and NGOs. I was the Associated Press correspondent, bureau chief in Haiti during the 2010 earthquake. My first book was about, you know, the international response to that earthquake. So I'm used to, you know, encountering, you know, different kinds of nonprofits, different kinds of 501c3s. One of my sort of rules of thumb, and this is not unique to me, is that the more innocuous the name, the more suspect, or like the more I want to say suspicious. There's another word I'm looking for, but like the more heightened my senses are. It's like, okay, so what is the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology? And I'm looking for, you know, I look at their website. They have a Substack for that specifically. They have a podcast, which Richard is the host of. They have, you know, a number of prominent guests, including Mark Andreessen, Steven Pinker, Brian Kaplan from Mercatus at George Mason. And I'm like, well, and I forget exactly, like, you know, at what point in my sort of initial like poking around. But you know, when I see a 501c3, I go for the 990s. I go for the tax documents because they're there, right? It's public information. It's there for anybody who wants to see it. And a lot of times you can tell a lot about a nonprofit by their tax filings, especially the larger ones, the more professional ones. They'll put in their tax filing, you know, the things that they did in the past year that they're most proud of. They'll put in, you know, their sources of funding. They'll put in, you know, their expenses, their location, just like lots of stuff, you know, information that is grist for the reporting mill. And what I noticed was that this organization that Hanania is the head of is, first of all, extremely small. It's got two other right-wing academics. I'm blanking on the names. George Hawley from the University of Alabama. And what was the other one? He's in Eric Kaufman, University of London and the Hudson Institute. And ultimately, that this organization, and this it took a couple of different, you know, rounds of reporting to uncover this. And I put out one newsletter, and actually, you know, some people who had some you know 990 searching tricks that I either hadn't thought of or had forgotten, to like look for, you know, different sources of this funding. But basically, this organization had taken in like $1.2 million from 2020 to 2022. So one thing, and cut me off if I'm droning, but like one thing that is notable to me is that this thing starts in 2020, right? And this is obviously a big moment in, you know, the history of American race relations, in the history of civil rights. There's the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd uprising, and for at that moment, for a thing, for a center that bills itself as the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, but seems to be the one thing that is interested in studying, and the ideology that it is trying, and the partisanship that it is trying to criticize very clearly, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Attempts to repair structural racism and the damages of America's history of racism, stuff like that, right? For an organization like that to pop up kind of out of nowhere in 2020, that's interesting, right? And it then brings in, $1.2 million in its first, I guess, 3 years. And in the 990s, you can see who they're paying grants to, because like the organization, which is, by the way, based out of what has to be Hanania's house. It's a house in the San Gabriel Valley, outside of Los Angeles. It's based in one house, and then a couple years later, after this organization has brought in more money, it moves to like another house. Like I look up the houses on Zillow, right? This is all public information, and it has to be his house. And this organization, like what it is a money funnel. Money is going in, and it's going out basically to the guys who run it and their friends. So the first year, they give out 2 grants. One is to Hawley and one is to Kaufman. And then the next year and the year after that, the big winner of this money is Richard Hanania. And he pockets, $297,500. So almost $300,000. And then I started looking like, well, who's funding this thing? We could talk about that if you want. But I was interested because, it's notable when, as Hamish McKenzie said in his, introduction of him on the Substack podcast, this guy seems to have come out of nowhere. But nobody really comes out of nowhere. Like people, to start getting a national platform like that, someone has to be helping you in some way. Either it's a national publication hiring you, or, as often happens on the right, billionaires, bankrolling people so that they can spend all of their time, fighting on Twitter and writing op-eds and doing sort of intellectual production. And it seemed that while I'm sure Richard's Substack is doing, decently, that a lot of the money that he's getting is through this kind of sketchy 501c3 that he runs.
For the audience, if they don't know this guy, let's explain what's he about. If you had to explain to somebody like on the street, what are his big? So he's a libertarian, I guess that's what he says now. Right.
So I'm trying to talk about this guy without sounding conspiratorial, but it is like as you noted, what I'm trying to say is what I'm getting ahead of myself and trying to say is there is his sort of current public facing persona, and then I think there is who he actually is, and those things are very closely related. But if you aren't somebody who swims in those waters, is used to just like critical reading of racists and the far right and the ways that they position themselves, there were things that somebody who is
reveal themselves.
Yes, yeah. There's somebody who's maybe more naive, could have.
Yeah. Right? We're going to get into the surprise in a second, but let's
here's
the new version of him.
Right. So here's the new the way that I think that most people who are promoting or encountering Richard Hanania would describe him is that he is, a libertarian, kind of clearly a right-leaning guy. But somebody who's a little bit idiosyncratic, right? He's very anti-woke. obsessed with, wokeism and dismantling it. But, he also was, in favor, I believe, of like the COVID vaccine, right? So people who were on the right were like, hey, Richard, like, it's a, this is Bill Gates is, trying to implant microchips into our bodies. And Richard's like, no, that is not true. That the vaccine helps people. It was sort of stuff like that, right? And so like that's kind of his, he's an academic. I shouldn't, that maybe is the first thing. He got a PhD in political science at UCLA. And in my initial round of reporting on him, I went and read his doctoral thesis as his dissertation, which is eye-opening in and of itself.
Well, what's it about?
It was about he was the main argument that popped out to me as I was reading it. It's about foreign policy, and it's about international intervention by the United States, which is a thing that I'm, by the way, very interested in myself. My most recent book is about American empire and
Gangsters of Capitalism.
Gangsters of Capitalism. That's it. And I've been a foreign correspondent for most of my career, and I cover the military. Like these are things that I'm interested in. His take on it is one of the weirdest takes that I've ever read, because his position is basically that American foreign policy, he's looking at the way that liberals and the way conservatives approach foreign policy. And basically he devises these surveys himself. And his surveys are like, what he finds is that liberals are basically so obsessed with helping Black people and hurting white people that they're sort of, reverse racism, I guess would be like the 90s way of describing it euphemistically, leads them to oppose, to back intervention when it's going to help Black people, and oppose it if it's going to help white people. That's like one of his major theses. The title of his dissertation was Moral Psychology and Support for the Use of Force in the International System. The other thing about Richard, which is interesting, and also I think makes him seem more interesting or more idiosyncratic than I think he actually is that he is the child of immigrants. His parents are Jordanian and Palestinian. I believe that they're both Christian. He grew up in, the south suburbs of Chicago, and, he's writing this thesis. This thesis comes out like in the late 20-teens, I think like 2017, 2018. And he is, he's writing, he's obviously doing his research, in an atmosphere in which Americans at that time, and for the decade and a half, 2 decades prior, have been obsessed with, above all, intervention in the Middle East. And he's writing about this as somebody who has this somewhat complicated identity from the Middle East, right, as a Christian. And so one of his findings that he thinks is very interesting is that conservatives show a preference for intervening on behalf of Christians over Muslims. But then he says that they are free of racial prejudice. And then, and like I said, he thinks that liberals are just, they're too into Black people, and that they're willing to bomb people if they think it's going to help Black people.
This is important, as we'll talk about. Are his parents post 65 immigrants?
I don't know. I assume so, right. Because I think, I believe I've seen him describe them as immigrants. He's in his 30s, so he was born in the 80s. So his parents wouldn't be, if they came before the immigration reform in 65, then they would have had to have come as very young children.
Well, that's bad news for them, because they got to go. according
Yeah.
to their son.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's yeah, because that's one of his positions is that, and this is
Yeah.
I can't even remember. Is this one of his Hanania positions or one of his host
The
positions at
host,
all?
host.
Oh,
This is
okay.
one of the
Got it.
host position. Yeah. So I mean, his academic credentials, he earned a J. I think he went to. I don't think he graduated high school, and he went to
He got a GED.
went to University of Colorado.
Right.
Then he got JD from the University of Chicago Law School in 2013, PhD in political science at UCLA in 2018.
Yeah.
Then he landed a postdoctoral research fellowship at Columbia University Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's cool for someone who got a GED, but
yeah.
But so
I hate how much we know about this guy.
Yeah. So it comes out this year as he's, you know, getting all these billionaire friends like Mark Andreessen. His career's he's got a book coming out called The Origins of Woke from HarperCollins soon, which I guess they're still going to publish.
Yeah, and which for people who don't know, that's Rupert Murdoch's like book imprint. So it's not. Yeah, it's basically Fox News books almost.
And this amazing article by Christopher Matthias comes out in the Huffington Post. Now, before this came out, did you suspect anything about this, or was it just out of the blue to you?
The fact that he was Richard Haas, or the fact that he had written for, you know, Richard Spencer's magazines and all these other things, that came out of the blue. I didn't know enough about the guy to have like looked into, you know, what he was doing, or you know, or figured out, you know, what he was doing under an assumed name. When I read it, like I was not. It didn't take me any time to be like, well, of course, of course, because, you know, as he. You know, I think John Gans, the my friend and the writer, I think, you know, the way he's put it is that, you know, he's been posting Stormfront on Maine, you know, for years. Like it's not surprising, but you know, the fact that he was like actively writing for real extreme, you know, racist publications. I wouldn't have even known where to look for that. So props to Chris for uncovering that.
Yeah, I want you to lay out the basics of it, but for the audience.
Yeah, so
under his fake name, Richard Host, he was writing for Occidental Observer, Countercurrents, and AlternativeRight.com. But actually, those first two, Occidental Observer and Countercurrents, those are like literally like pro-Hitler.
Yes. Yeah.
Publication.
Yeah. 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 And the things that he was writing in those places were genocidal, flat out. He was saying that anyone who is, as he calls it, of a low IQ, first of all, he is obsessed, and he is still obsessed with this, with race and intelligence, right? That's his big thing. He's a eugenicist. His whole thing is that intelligence is hereditary, that it is racial, and that you can sort of make meaningful differences between races based on their IQ scores. He's obsessed with this. And as Richard Hanania, he's obsessed with this. As Richard Haas, 10 years ago, he was saying that on that basis, that everybody who has what he considers a low IQ should be forcibly sterilized. So genocided. I mean, basically prevent them from ever having children and wipe them out over the course of a generation.
And also he said in a 2010 Countercurrents article, he said the ultimate goal should be to get all the post 1965. Oh, I guess this is the important thing for him. Non-white migrants from Latin America to leave. Yes. Okay, so his parents are in the clear, I guess.
Well, because it's. I mean, it's interesting. It is. Without trying to disentangle, like there's some fascinating psychological and Freudian stuff going on with this guy, but he clearly, you know, he is if you look at a picture of him, he just looks like a white dude, like I do, right? He's, he presents as white. He, like I said, he grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago, and a lot of what he writes, even as Hanania, and then also as Haast, and before this, it very clearly comes out of a very Chicago and even more specifically, like white suburban Chicago experience, right? Where Chicago is this extremely violent place that is overrun by Black people who are just in gangs, and they are and murderous and out of control. And he also went to the University of Chicago, so he lived in Hyde Park on the south side. I lived in Chicago for many years as well. I went to university there as well.
It's so interesting. Yeah, his brother got arrested for like throwing cats off of parking garages in Orland Park, I believe. But it's very interesting. Is somebody from Chicagoland. Nick Fuentes, the Gen Z Nazi, is from LaGrange Park, which is a southwest side suburbs. But there were like Chicago January 6th people arrested, and a lot of them were from specifically like the southwest suburbs.
Yeah, and I think he's specifically from Oak Lawn.
Yeah, Oak Lawn. Yeah. Not Orland Park. My mistake. Yeah, and
well, I don't know where Francis is from, but it's interesting, right? Because
he's from about the same area.
Yeah,
it's interesting,
and not I mean, sort of in the general direction of I guess Cicero, like that's where Martin Luther King got hit with a brick. There's, I mean, it is a very it's a very Chicago thing, and he writes a lot about he one of the things that I noted in my first piece about him on my Substack on the Racket was that he talks about I think like how Black people had like ethnically cleansed Chicago. It's really like people really lose it. I mean, this is a national thing as well about Chicago. I mean, people really lose it when talking about Chicago. It's really interesting. We could do probably a whole episode trying to like unpack the psychology about like that specific thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably well known, but in case any listeners don't know, Chicago is sort of a tale of two cities in a way. The south side of Chicago and the north side, it's very segregated.
Right.
And so the south side of Chicago is very African American, and I do think that you do notice a stark difference between the whites from the southwest suburbs,
right,
and the whites from like the northern suburbs.
Right,
they're more liberal on the north side. So just some
I mean, and I mean, without going too deep into it, like Chicago is a big hub of the Great Migration, right? So as Black people are fleeing terror and racism in the Deep South, one of the major places they go is Chicago. And Chicago is like also this, to use the cliche, it's it's a melting pot. There's all these different immigrant groups from all over the world, especially Poland and Ireland and Italy, a lot of Jews, who are all sort of mixed in here, and then Black people come up from into that, and this is among other things where the blues comes from, right? Because like that's why Chicago is like the home of the blues, and a lot of people's ideas about Chicago are basically it's because the people who are fleeing Jim Crow, they encounter these other white people, and these other white people start kind of they create sort of an alternative to Jim Crow, and Chicago is like a real experimental place for housing discrimination, redlining, aggressive policing, It's not, again, it's not alone in that. Like a lot of American cities are like that, but because Chicago is such a big city, and in a lot of ways, because it's like the big city in the middle of the country, like it's in a lot of ways, for a lot of its history, it's kind of been like the great American city, where like New York is like more of like an international city. And so, there's a lot of freight in Chicago. It's not an accident that people, when people talk about black on black crime, or black criminality in general, that they are often obsessed with Chicago. And as you said,
they'll just like Vivek Ramaswamy, they'll sort of use Chicago just as
right,
a euphemism for black people.
even though by the numbers, like it's often, I mean, there's crime, and there's I reported on I covered murder trials. I went to journalism school at Northwestern, and I covered murder trials at 26 in California at the Cook County court and jail. And I knew some gang members, and I'm aware that these things happen and that they're real. There are dangerous parts of Chicago, mostly dangerous for the people who live in them. But Chicago's the sort of the threat that Chicago embodies in the minds of a lot of people is like way out of proportion, to put it mildly.
It is interesting. Richard Spencer and Hanania, both University of Chicago alums. Hyde Park it's one of the most segregated. I mean, it's basically like this super elite, very Asian and white university surrounded by some of the like poorest, mostly African-American neighborhoods in the country. So it's interesting. I wonder if they had gone to like school in Ann Arbor, or or Eugene, Oregon, if it would have been the same. That's interesting.
Yeah, because like what these places have in common, Evanston is similar in a way. But what in particular Hyde Park and Oak Lawn have in common is they are places that are sort of surrounded by or adjacent to the quote unquote bad parts of Chicago. So they're places where sort of, the black neighborhoods, the ghetto of Chicago, exists as like a place of imagination. That you're not really in it, you're just beyond it, and you're imagining the horrors that you're imagining, are happening there. And it's really a place where a young somewhat troubled person whose brother is chucking cats off of garage flips, I can't believe that, and has his own sort of interesting intersectional relationship with his own whiteness as the child of Arab immigrants, during like the 90s and during the ultimately during the 9/11 and Iraq war era. Like, it is very easy to imagine sort of the fever dreams that don't inevitably come. Plenty of people have a biological what am I talking about? Biographical. Jesus, the Hanania's eugenics is like infecting my brain. A biographical profile that looks a lot like his, and did not end up becoming, just like a virulent, anti-black racist. But it is easy to imagine the ways in which that could get cooked up.
It's interesting. How much have you looked into his old Richard Host articles? Because was he writing like, I know he wrote anti-Semitic stuff, but it seems like what you're saying, he was mostly focused on like this anti-black stuff and this IQ stuff, but he is writing for these super Nazi websites like Occidental Observer and Countercurrents.
Yeah. Was
he writing like about Jews too, or?
I think so. Let me see if in the
he does bring it up. Like he clearly doesn't. It's funny. He's like, he doesn't. Not that it matters, but it's always indication when people are really, really into Nazi stuff. Like he doesn't believe Jews are white,
right?
Which is whatever. I mean, it doesn't. but it usually, I find the most extreme anti-Semites strongly believe that.
Well, he writes in the Occidental Observer. This is in Matthias's piece, but he writes about this piece about Sarah Palin that he calls White Goddess. And he says, it has been suggested that Sarah Palin is sort of a Rorschach test for Americans. The attractive, religious, and fertile white woman drove the ugly, secular, and barren white, self-hating, and Jewish elite absolutely mad well before there are any questions about her qualifications. By the way, I don't ever remember a time that there were no questions about Sarah Palin's qualifications, but that's neither here nor there. But like that is like, that's just pure Nazi shit, right? It's just like, it's not just about Jews, but it's about the fertile white people versus like the ugly, secular, and barren Jewish elite, and also the white self-hating elite, which is that's also a Nazi thing. So and he's still obsessed with Jews. He's still, if like on his Twitter feed, like he's constantly posting about how disgusted he is at what he sees as excessive philo-Semitism on the right. He writes about how he talks about like a sad story of like an unrequited love affair or something like that between the American right and Jews. He thinks that basically Jews are using the right and hoodwinking the right to then enact our whatever he thinks we're doing. I don't know.
I think you've described it really well, but yeah, his thing, and so he's got this impressive academic background, and I think he wrote some stuff on Afghanistan, and it's like I agree Afghanistan was absurd, and so it's like, I think that got him in the Washington Post, and then his niche became, or is, sort of being like on the right but willing to say, the New York Times actually is more trustworthy than Breitbart.
Right.
And exactly. They're like, look at this moderate centrist. Exactly. This guy's amazing.
Exactly. That's his game. It's an old game. I mean, it is, sort of generally speaking, people on the right, paleoconservatives, and the sort of the libertarian milieu that honestly a lot of fascists and right-wing extremists, somewhat paradoxically, when you think about libertarianism, or at least as libertarianism advertises itself, but they come out of that firmament.
Christopher Cantwell.
Exactly. He's actually I was thinking about him specifically as I was saying that. And also Richard Spencer, right? He was
the American conservative. Yeah.
Exactly. So, they've known for a long time, because, partisanship, the study of partisanship, in America, we often oversimplify, we have a two-party system, and you've got Democrats and Republicans, and we oversimplify, what the positions are on both sides of that divide. And so for years, and still to some extent in the Republican mainstream, you had, the main Republican Party line was war, right? They loved war. They wanted to invade Afghanistan after 9/11 and did. They wanted to invade Iraq and did. They were hoping to, bring it to Syria very explicitly, and just sort of, Iran, and just sort of, bring the forever war everywhere. And then you had this, paleoconservative group, as they called themselves, originally, I think pejoratively, and then they kind of adopted it for themselves to some extent. Kind of the Pat Buchanan right, that had always, and to some extent, Ron Paul. I mean, Ron Paul was definitely anti-war, but to some extent, Ron Paul, I think, is a paleoconservative as well. Like, they were critics of that, and since war was the big project of the Republican Party, throughout especially the Bush years, being like, well, I'm a conservative, but I think that, the Iraq war was bad. And I think that, we shouldn't have so many foreign wars. That could get you a lot of cred among, moderates and liberals, and even leftists, as being like, oh, you're idiosyncratic. Like you're not being doctrinaire. You're not following the party line. Like you're thinking for yourself.
And it's very important you bring that up, and I want to touch on this later, which is this generational question. But I remember the birth of the alt-right. I remember alternativeright.com. Like I remember the first time sort of Spencer came on the scene, before we all knew the guy was a Nazi.
Right.
And they did just cast themselves as we don't like Bush.
Right.
We don't like Bush. It wasn't like, and we'll get into it later, the way the alt-right evolved, because I want to get into Hochman stuff. But so I knew Hanania was set up for life when I saw that he was doing like these 2-hour podcasts with Conehead, also known as Mark Andreessen, who is he the I call him Conehead.
That's very funny. Sorry.
And he's the founder of Netscape. He's super rich. He is like one of the most powerful VCs, people in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. And uses and is also like very ideological. I think he poses as being, non-ideological. But everywhere he goes, it's sort of, always the same thing, anti-woke, free speech in the way that only, the far right talks about.
Jonathan, I cannot tell you the number of times I've looked at the profiles of small Nazi accounts on Twitter, like with like 1,000 followers.
Yeah.
And every time it says followed by Mark Andreessen.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
He blocked me years ago. So
okay. He follows so many Nazi accounts. Yeah. It's wild. So anyways,
it wouldn't surprise me. And he's a big backer of, he came in the time since I started at Substack. I started with my Substack in 2019. It was after that Andreessen came in during a VC round. And that was really when I think, Substack started taking its big, rightward turn.
Yeah. So when I saw Hanania with Andreessen, I knew this guy was made for life.
Yeah.
And he is really close with, let me back up and say this. There's so many terrible things about Musk owning Twitter, but one of the few upsides is that this myth of the super liberal Silicon Valley is slowly dying. Or at least like, okay, the workers, the coders they might be more liberal, but the guys at the top, these people aren't just right wing. They're extremely, and it's very interesting. Peter Thiel has gotten so much bad press over the years, right? Yeah. But Andreessen, who follows all these Nazi accounts, hasn't. And Musk is part of that. And so
it is astounding. The one of the ways that I started really encountering it was during Clubhouse. Remember that brief moment?
Yeah.
And there were all these like rooms on Clubhouse that were just eugenics. It was just straight up, just eugenics in a way that like I knew that there were anti-Semites. I knew there were like racist. I knew there were people in the world who thought these things, but like it was out there and they were just talking and these rooms were very popular. And then I would see people who were in these rooms, like, pop up in other places for a while. I'm totally blanking on her last name. Her first name is Lulu. She was hired by Substack when Andreessen came in with his funding round, as like the spokeswoman. And she was somebody who was just constantly in these like eugenicist rooms on Clubhouse. And I think that like one of the things that's really telling to me is that, Hamish McKenzie and Chris Best, who's the CEO of Substack, that they would look at a guy, Hanania, who is still out there under his own name. Like his whole thing is race and IQ, race and IQ, race and IQ, and sort of like inherent criminality, and that this wouldn't just like ring an alarm bell for them. That it would be like, oh, that this could be like a good faith, honest dealer who could be an interesting person to talk to. That just says a lot about the culture of Silicon Valley. That like that stuff is just out there, and it is just so normal, and it is so like almost like taken for granted by a lot of people. That like, of course you would think that. Of course that's a thing that normal people would think. And just to me, as somebody who doesn't come from that world at all, Silicon Valley world at all, I was like, it was really eye-opening to realize how much in conversation those ideas.
So you did some of the groundbreaking reporting on Hanania. Yeah. So who are his backers? Because some of them have surprising background.
Yes. So so one of the big ones that I found, and because he actually contributed to the NGO, the 501c3 under his name, is Andrew Conroe, who is best known as the creator of adultfriendfinder.com. He created originally the original Friend Finder. It was kind of like in a lot of ways like the original social network. But he found very quickly that using this as basically a place to sell porn and hook up escorts with clients was much more lucrative. I think he ended up selling Friend Finder networks to Penthouse for like $500 million in the mid-aughts. And he has something, the Conroe Foundation. He wrote a check to Hanania's thing for $200,000. He also got $50,000 from the Mercatus Center, which is the right-wing libertarian think tank at George Mason. That's backed by the Kochs, but it's the Koch brothers, but also other prominent donors.
And they employed Tyler Cowen, and Brian Kaplan, who are two of Hanania's
exactly
libertarian buddies.
Yeah, and those two combined for about $250 million, but excuse me, not $1 billion, $250,000, 250,000. But the bulk of the money, the biggest things, I don't know who's behind them, because he got them from donors who are hiding behind what are known as donor advised funds, specifically a Fidelity Fund and a Schwab fund. And those are often used to fund things that the donor doesn't want publicly known that they're being associated with, so that it is often a way of funding hate groups and racist activities in general. And the IRS talks about this, and they know. They have a note on their website that says that they're aware of organizations that have, quote, abused the basic concepts underlying donor advised funds. The idea is basically that the money goes to the bank, but the donor can advise the bank on how to donate it. So the only thing that appears on any kind of publicly searchable tax document is that Fidelity, wrote a check to Hanania, but it wasn't Fidelity's money. It was somebody else's money. But, a educated guess would be possibly Peter Thiel,
or
Andreessen.
Also, he was at University of Texas at a center there that got Harlan Crow, the
that's right,
Clarence Thomas's good buddy.
Yes, and one of the interesting things is there were only two places that I'm aware of that in any way distanced themselves from Hanania when his previous genocidal writings were surfaced and unmasked. One of them, the one that did so publicly, was the University of Austin.
Barry Weiss.
Barry U, which is very funny. Like just on many levels, that like he was there lecturing in what they called the forbidden courses. I just love that, like, even Barry Weiss, of course not even Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss has always been she has never been a free speech absolutist by any stretch of the imagination. She, her first public thing was as an undergrad at Columbia, trying to get professors fired for criticizing Israel. But that it's basically free speech absolutist state university that was the first to distance. It's not even a real university.
So is he going to lecture at Stanford, or
he has
said anything?
I don't know yet. I haven't heard that they canceled that. But the thing that I was going to say that's interesting is that it was the University of Austin publicly distanced themselves from him. They're like, we didn't know about his racist writings, and if we had, we wouldn't have invited him. And the Salem Center at the University of Texas at Austin was quieter, but they dropped him from their website, and he kind of seems to have confirmed on his social media feed that he says that his fellowship was scheduled to end there anyway. Who knows? The interesting thing about that is that both the real University of Texas at Austin Center and the fake University of Austin both have Harlan Crow as a major donor. The Forbidden Courses series that he lectured at is hosted at one of Harlan Crow's properties, actually the old Parkland Hospital where JFK died after the assassination in Dallas. Right. So it is interesting that the two that distance themselves from him are both Harlan Crow connected. Possibly a coincidence, possibly not, but that's notable. But yeah, as you said, he had recently given a speech at the Yale Federal Society. He was scheduled at least in October to speak at Stanford Business School, and as far as I know, that's still on, but I haven't checked.
So this comes out that he's written for all these Nazi websites, and he wanted to like sterilize people he thought were low IQ and all this stuff. And he says, I've completely changed. And anyway, so I read his so-called apology, and it was like one or two sentences that were sort of like, I'm kind of sorry, maybe. And then the rest of it is just attacking the journalist, like Christopher Matthias for.
Well, he calls him an Antifa journalist. Right?
Yeah, and so it's interesting. I keep tabs on the right a lot, right, podcasts, right? So I remember before this had all come out, I was in Wyoming, up high in the mountains, and I was listening to the Richard Hanania's podcast he does with this woman, Inez Stepman.
Oh yeah.
Called Clown Car.
Right.
And this is like, 3 weeks before he's going to get exposed as writing for all these Nazi websites. And what is he yammering on and on about? How we have to get rid of the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
But he's casting it all, and it's just a libertarian thing.
Right.
It's just a libertarian thing. It's, and I'm sure, and he was like, I'm sure the market will make sure there's no like bigotry.
And then you let the markets, let freedom go and let the markets do what they want. Like, we don't know that, like, you could have maintained segregation. Like, we don't know that black people wouldn't have had on the highway because we never tried the freedom. We had Jim Crow, and then we had anti-discrimination laws. We had no, like, period with which to even test the proposition that markets can actually work. And I think that there's a lot of historical evidence that, like, when groups are discriminated against, unless you actually force them apart, people chase profits. All the white Southerners, 100% of the white Southerners can be racist. Nothing is stopping black people from opening hotels. Nothing is stopping immigrants from opening hotels. Nothing is stopping white Northerners from coming in and opening hotels.
And then he gets revealed as this. So I listened after he was exposed. I listened to his the podcast.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, it was the same thing. He does like one sentence of like, I don't believe some of that stuff. And then the rest of it is totally attacking the left for not being racist. And then him and Stepman start talking about how they have hope for the future.
Right.
And the what is giving them hope, it's not like kids volunteering at the local homeless shelter.
Right.
It's that the Congressman Gosar of Arizona, is doing fundraisers and hanging out with the Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes,
Right.
and he hasn't denounced him
until recently. And I'm wondering if you think that actually is changing, because it seems like Peter, I don't think is like blackballed from the right. You, I don't think are going to be blackballed from the right. Nate, I don't think is going to be blackballed from the right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's crazier than that. Nick Fuentes is hanging out with like congressmen. I mean, you see, like Paul Gosar was like speaking at like Nick Fuentes' event or something like that. And as far as I know, these congressmen don't denounce him. So I think we really are in a new world. I think the polarization is such that like something like Huffington Post has no, has no sort of, credibility to be telling people how they should think about different issues to the right. So yeah.
Right.
This gives them hope for the future.
What Hanania said in his non-apology, he said, quote, "The reason I'm the target of a cancellation effort is because left-wing journalists dislike anyone acknowledging statistical differences between races. My mistake in a previous life was assigning collective guilt based on certain undeniable facts." And like what he's clearly saying there, I mean, he's saying it blatantly, that his problem was not that he was racist, because he's still racist. He's saying, I am still racist. I still think that the undeniable fact underpinning society are, quote, statistical differences between races. What he regrets is that he was prescribing genocide before. And now, and he quotes, I think it's Brian Kaplan, or he cites Brian Kaplan as being the person who inspired this thought, that it's worth basically keeping some non-white people around. He says, quote, "Even if groups differ in skills or cognitive abilities, we can all still benefit from the division of labor," which is literally the justification for slavery in the mid-19th century in the United States.
Yeah, and the co-host Stedman says in the beginning, well, you haven't really changed your views. You just, I forget what she says. She's like, you've just moderated them.
We'll get to the apology part in a minute, but I want to ask, because even in your apology, right, you don't completely denounce some of the views that you hold. You're more moderated about them now. You're more circumspect and more mature about them. And you're not as radical, but
they literally just say that. Like, I have all the same views as I did when I was writing for like the pro-Hitler site.
Right.
I just have moderated them.
Now instead of calling for genocide outright, now he's calling for essentially neo-segregation. Like, he's basically saying, like, let's roll back the Civil Rights Act. Let's gut it. And this is another thing that Vox did reporting on this, and it's very much pertinent right now, that Vivek Ramaswamy, the new Republican presidential candidate flavor of the week, he wrote his book Woke Incorporated, in which he was calling for basically using civil rights law to protect racism. Right? He was basically saying, like, we should put into jurisprudence or into the Civil Rights Act protection for political speech, which would basically say that the protection that is given to people who are the victims of racism should also be given to racists. And Hanania was the one, he wrote a review of Ramaswamy's book, and he was like, this guy doesn't get it. He's totally wrong, because you can't use, he's basically making like kind of like a racist Audre Lorde kind of you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Basically, like you can't dismantle the anti-racist house using anti-racist tools. He's basically saying, like, you have to end this legal regime of civil rights in order to, because it is that, and that's the argument that he's going to be making in his book that comes out in I guess a couple of weeks, that got effusive blurbs from Peter Thiel and Ramaswamy and David Sachs and all these other guys,
and JD Vance, the Ohio senator's big fan too.
JD Vance, who's a friend of Ramaswamy's, from
Peter Thiel.
Yeah. All these guys, Peter Thiel, took Ramaswamy and Vance out to to lunch when they were both students at Yale Law. Like they're all buddies with each other.
Yeah, and when this all got revealed, Elon Musk became a paid subscriber to Hanania.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, another one of his paid subscribers is Steven Pinker. He was a big fan of his. The thing that's interesting, and I don't remember if it was you or somebody pointed this out to me, because I'm not a big reader of Countercurrents magazine ordinarily. But Greg Johnson, who is the white nationalist editor of that magazine, he wrote a piece about the unmasking of Hanania as Richard Haast. And he's basically saying that he had published Hanania at Countercurrents, but under the pseudonym, and that he writes about how he thought that Hanania had some good ideas, but that that he was a libertarian who occasionally hinted at race realism, was the way he put it, right? But that he never went far enough down the road of overt fascism. And Johnson writes, I think, one of the most telling things that I've read about this entire episode. He says that once he has realized that Hanania is Haast, he says, quote, "The most charitable interpretation of Richard Hanania's career trajectory is that he remained race-wise and Jew-wise, but edged up to the mainstream to inject good ideas and shift the Overton window." And then he says, he was wildly successful. And, that is very clearly what Hanania is doing. I mean, again, he is not concealing this at all. He says overtly that we need, more, policing, incarceration, and surveillance of Black people. When Alvin Bragg, who's the DA of Manhattan, and is himself Black, when he indicted Daniel Penny for strangling a Black subway rider to death on the F train in New York, Hanania tweeted, this was like in March, they're all animals, whether they're walking around in suits or riding subway cars. I mean, like
sounds like a respectable centrist, really important thinker to me. I mean, right?
Yeah. It's all out there. Like you have to be. It requires both. It's really interesting. It requires both. It's hard to look at this and not see a significant amount of willful blindness in people like Matt Iglesias and the editors of the New York Times who are, and the Washington Post, who are publishing Hanania. Ross Douthat, I always screw up the pronunciation of his name. Speaking of names get screwed up, but like he recommended Hanania's writing like 9 different times in his columns and newsletters. Like, to a certain extent, maybe they're just not seeing this stuff. To a certain extent, maybe, this kind of is what I was talking about with like, Mackenzie and Best at Substack. Maybe they're just like so surrounded by this just like overt, like 19th century style, like race science, that they don't even think it's weird anymore. Or maybe they just agree with it entirely. But it's wild to me that you can, it's wild to me that anybody could have read anything that Hanania has been writing in public, for all these years, and been like, well, I don't agree with him about everything, but he's got some good things.
There's another person that the New York Times, another young conservative,
that
the New York Times published multiple times.
Yeah.
Named Nate Hochman.
Yeah.
And he made a Nazi video for the DeSantis campaign.
Right.
In public, in a way, like he didn't even do it on a fake name. He was openly making it with these other DeSantis campaign people.
Right.
I like, so for instance, the Know My Enemy podcast,
Yeah.
Sam Alderbell and Matthew Sidman. I like what they do. I'm a
Yeah.
big fan.
Me too.
But
I think I'm a paid subscriber to Know Your
Yeah,
Enemy.
but their last episode, they said Nate Hochman, Rod Dreher tweeted out that Nate Hochman said, I had no idea what the Black Sun was. And he had these troops marching into a spinning black sun superimposed over DeSantis's face in this fascist video. And he says, I had no idea what that was. I had no idea that was a fascist symbol. Now, the Know My Enemy guys, they apparently believe that. I mean, what's your take?
So first of all, about the video that he made, with the headline, and it's a fine headline, is that it included a Sonarand, a neo-Nazi black sun symbol, and as you note, it's used in this tableau of literally like soldiers marching toward the Florida flag, which it's a St. Andrew's cross, so it's a big red X, which also invokes the Confederate flag, and then DeSantis in front of it with the Nazi black sun in the background. So even right there, like, not particularly subtle, right? But beyond that, and I didn't even know this the first time I wrote about it, I ended up doing a follow-up newsletter about it. The whole thing is patterned, shot for shot, beat for beat, on a neo-Nazi video format. It is a, the video is of, it's a Doomer Wojak, right? So kind of a crudely drawn cartoon everyman who represents the viewer, like the young male gamer type viewer, who is watching sort of a succession of things that disappoint him. And it is always, headlines about diversity, and sort of in like in the Nazi versions, which are out there, you can find them. It's often like, like the British, National Mint, releasing a coin with the black face on it, or like, U.S. soldiers marching, holding like a pride flag or something like that. In the Hochman video, because it's a campaign ad, what he's doing is he's showing that the Doomer Wojak is depressed because he's watching Donald Trump betray the things that far right people wanted him to do. Right. So it's like, no new sections of wall were built by Trump during his presidency. And, Trump, I don't know, did something that helped black people. It's just stuff like that. Right. And then in the video, this is like the meme format. And the music, by the way, it's a cover
that hill.
Running up that hill. Exactly. I have seen a Nazi version of this, uses the same version of the same song, same spot in the music. The screen fades to black, a kind of a backlit door opens, and a silhouetted figure comes out. And in the Nazi versions, it's sort of like a Chad. It's just like a muscle bound white guy. I don't know, maybe somebody who knows more about this kind of piece of esoteric Nazi whatever might even recognize who the guy is. But as far as I can tell, it's just sort of a Chad. In the Hochman version, it's DeSantis. And this sort of messianic white figure then takes the Doomer Wojak to essentially Nazi heaven, Nazi utopia. And in the Nazi version, it's these very, very specific Nazi memes of, these sort of mythological, Nordic, ancient Greek, Hanging Gardens of Babylon type places with like the maps of like this kind of very Nazi like fantasy, and in the Hochman version, DeSantis takes the Doomer Wojak to Florida, which is that it's his utopia. To say this is not an accident. You can't do this accidentally. I'm sorry. Like,
sir, he was trying to celebrate Latino heritage, and he thought it was an Aztec symbol. He had no, even though he was admitted Nick Fuentes fan.
It is impossible. It is I know you're joking. I just really have to underline this. Like, you cannot, this is not like, oops, I tripped and fell on my dick. Like, this is like, he had to, whoever made this video, and Axios reported that Hochman either made it or played a role in making it, had to have been just imbibing this very, very particular format of Nazi video. By the way, in one of the Nazi videos that I watched, it doesn't even end on a Nazi symbol. Hochman was like, or whoever made it, Hochman was like, in case anybody doesn't get this, because they're not like, frequenting the same image boards that I am, I'm going to end this with a spinning Nazi, glowing Nazi symbol. Just in case my message is too subtle.
And it's important to point out, this is not, look, who hasn't had one Nazi scandal? Okay, we've all had one. This is his second.
Right.
His first one was praising the what I just call him the pro-Hitler cult leader, Nick Fuentes, who dreams his life goal is like leading pogroms. He, praising him. So we know he was a Nick Fuentes fan.
Yeah.
So it's just like, ask the Nick Fuentes fans. Do they know what a black sun is? They do.
Right. Of course
they all
do.
know what
of course
it is.
They do. And a lot of people on the right do. And this is one of the things, is that like these people, they're all hanging out in the same places. They're all hanging out on the same message boards. And some of them think, look, I have absolutely no doubt that a significant number of Nazis think that, Nate Hochman is a cuck, right? That he doesn't go nearly far enough. He's a sellout, whatever. But they're all in conversation with one another.
So this is the prism that I saw the Hanania expose from.
Right.
Because my focus is on the Gen Z right, because I think people just don't get how Nazi it is. Like, they have no idea how bad it is. So I looked at the Hanania situation. I was thinking the Hochman situation.
Right.
Well, Hanania is a millennial.
Right.
Okay. So he wrote all this under fake name, right? So there's sort of some shame, right?
Right.
And Hochman publicly was making this with his work colleagues at the DeSantis campaign. The group chats came out. They were all, one of the people, Kyle Lamb said, one of the people at the DeSantis campaign said, this should be in the Smithsonian.
Right.
So he's publicly doing it. And so
this is being shared on a chat thread overseen by Christina Pushaw, who's one of DeSantis's chief spokeswomen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he's publicly making this. So to me, I saw that generational angle of millennial. They still are like trying to hide it. The Gen Z are just so much more extreme. But for listeners, I want to put this in context. I think this all happened during the summer. Okay. Hunter Walker, the reporter, revealed that Paul Gosar, the Arizona Republican congressman, has 2 neo-Nazi cult members on his staff.
Yeah.
One of them is literally given an oath to this Holocaust denier, Nick Fuentes, to quote, where they have to raise up the right hand and pledge to rape, murder, and kill for Nicholas J. Fuentes. Okay?
Jesus Christ.
Hasn't been fired. I don't think Republicans have spoken out. They're still there. One of them's names is Wade Searle. That's one. Pedro Gonzalez, this
Yeah.
big guy is on Tucker and very hooked into the conservative world, also worked for DeSantis, revealed to be this giant anti-Semite in these private text messages, like to the degree he's like, no, Nancy Pelosi, she's a Jew,
Right.
like, and
Right.
posting like insane anti-Semitic cartoons and all this stuff. Then you have Hockman, the Nazi ad is exposed, and then
And by the way,
Hanania.
you brought up Paul Gosar. Gosar shared on his Twitter feed
Oh, yeah.
another version of the same meme video
Yeah.
that Hockman shared, except instead of the Chad or DeSantis coming through the door, it was Gosar, and that got taken down after a couple of days, but it's still out there if you look on Internet Archive.
But what I'm trying to say is this is a trend. But so I've heard somebody told me he estimated 50% of the Gen Z Republican congressional staffers were like Groypers, which is basically just a new version of Nazis.
Yeah.
What would you guess that number is?
I don't know. I mean, I can't guess on the number, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, there's a couple of different aspects of it. I mean, shit posting and just like being a general asshole online, and going for ever more extreme online personas and imagery. Look, social media rewards that. It's a way to stand out. I'm not drawing I'm trying not to draw a false equivalency here, because I don't think they're the same at all. But like on TikTok, the number of Zoomer leftists who ironically or unironically share memes of like Lenin, with his eyes glowing, or there was like an AI TikTok filter where people were posing as like Soviet propaganda posters. I was born in 1980. For me, it was you were really putting yourself out there, in the 90s or in the aughts, when I was the age that these kids are now, to be like, I'm a communist. There were certainly people who were, but like it was a big statement. And now it's a more common, and there are other non-political things as well, where it's just like the hard, a lot of fandoms, right? You could be a Swiftie, but you should be like a super Swiftie. You could be like into BTS, but like you got to be like going after and destroying all the enemies of BTS. And that kind of attitude, like it doesn't surprise me in a way that these tendencies, when combined with reactionary tendencies on the right in general, could lead somebody to being as extreme as possible in those ways. The thing that makes it very different when you're talking about fascists and Nazis and neo-Nazis is there are other ways that they could have gone. You could start getting like extreme like Reagan memes or something like that, right? Where it's like, or even like, we're gonna, drop nukes on our enemies, but like, under like a big like American flag. It is a real interesting and telling choice to really lean into like these specifically fascist tendencies. And for me, it's impossible from my point of view, it's impossible to understand that without understanding Trump and the very clear from the beginning of his campaign fascist tendencies of Trump's campaign, his first campaign, and of his presidency, which culminated for the moment in an attempt to overthrow the United States government. But you've got all of these different things, and I talk about in my latest book, in Gangsters of Capitalism, I talk about the ways in which American imperialism in the early 20th century, imperialism in general, creates fascism. as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon and Hannah Arendt, and lots of writers have written about this in lots of different ways. Arendt calls it the boomerang effect. Fanon says, what is fascism but colonialism practiced in the heart of a traditionally colonialist country? And I write about the ways in which that era of American imperialism came back home in the form of fascism, and it is very, very clearly has been happening now. It's very clear that the othering and the iron fist and the aggressive, murderous attitude toward perceived enemies of America and American civilization and Western civilization in general, came back home. And it's like, well, if we can do that to people in the Middle East, why can't we just do that to our political enemies here? And those things are out there, and they have become in the Trump era extremely mainstream. I mean, I remember 7-8 years ago, if you saw like a Punisher decal on somebody's car or a Gadsden flag at a protest, you'd be like, oh, okay, this guy is like, he's a little bit far right. Now that stuff is just normal. Like, QAnon, like boomers, like the idea of an ideal political settlement being some kind of a civil war, or rounding up the libs and executing them at Guantanamo. Like, it's not in the mainstream of the mainstream, but like it's close enough that like things like that can be sort of brought up in more or less.
I view those people as like the moderates. Almost.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. When I'm saying
yeah.
it, I guess it's taking me a while to get there. But what I'm saying is that like, if you've got like if being like a 3%er or an oath keeper is a moderate, then like, well, what are you going to do to be more extreme than that? If you're a teenager, if you're a college student, trying to make a name for yourself in a milieu in which, the more extreme you are, the more attention that you're going to get. And so like, of course, like the only place to go, to the right of that, is Nazism. And I don't think that these are things that you can just play with harmlessly, without seeing them, without having people, decide at various points to make them a reality. And Richard Hanania in particular, I mean, in some ways, as I think you were noting, they're from different generations, Hanania and Hochman. And they also, in some ways, are kind of two different cases that in a lot of ways shine light on one another. Because Hanania comes from being, I am an extremist, like I am a Nazi, and I'm going to moderate my views to get into the mainstream. And Hochman is like, I'm a rising, movement conservative. He writes for National Review. He gets a summer fellowship from the American Enterprise Institute. Then he's at the Claremont Institute, which is, a harder right, but still somewhat on the periphery of mainstream. And then how am I going to make myself stand out as a speechwriter on this, major national presidential campaign that for a while looked like it had a shot. It doesn't have a shot, but for a while it looked like it might have a shot at contesting for the Republican nomination. Well, what I'm going to do, he talks about this in a piece where he's interviewed in the New York Times Magazine. He talks about being, people who are willing to go into the goo of the fever swamp, I think is the way he puts it. He definitely uses the word goo, and basically like really, really go and talk to like the absolute like scariest, worst people. And what he's saying, and what he clearly, the conclusion that he clearly comes to is, I'm going to make neo-Nazi memes to try to get some Nazis onto our campaign to show other Nazis that this is the cool campaign to be part of. And that is how I'm going to distinguish myself in front of this, Republican governor. And that is how I'm going to, build my power and brand. And once you do that, I mean, it is really hard to it's really hard to and maybe pointless to come up with any kind of differentiation between somebody who's doing that for clout and somebody who's doing it because they actually believe it. And so, Hawkman turns into Hanania, Hanania turns into Hawkman. They're all just kind of turning into each other, and I don't feel like it's heading in a good direction.
Did you read alternativeright.com ever when it was online?
Some, I mean, I became, like a lot of, I mean, when in the time that Hanania was writing for them, I was living overseas, in Haiti, actually, which is another place that Hanania as Host went ahead and wrote a column, probably actually in the immediate wake of the earthquake in 2010,
citing the Nazi author of the Turner Diary.
Exactly.
Well, exactly. I only asked because I remember that, and I think some people don't understand this, but it's very telling that one of the earliest articles that Spencer ran on alternativeright.com was by Jason Richwine. Do you remember him?
The name rings a bell, but tell me.
Yeah, he wrote for it, and he got a PhD from Harvard, and was like saying like we shouldn't have low IQ immigrants and stuff. And I think he lost a job at AEI.
Got it.
But he's Jewish.
Got it.
And it was one of their first articles. They ran an article by this Jewish guy. And I don't think the comments were like virulent anyways.
Right.
And a lot of people didn't think Spencer was a Nazi in like 2010 or 2011. Then fast forward to Charlottesville, and it all became clear. But like, compare a Richard Spencer talk from 2010 to a Nick Fuentes talk today.
Right.
If you word search the word Jew or Hitler in the Spencer talk, you wouldn't even find it. Probably.
Right.
It is. So do you agree with me that the Gen Z is much, much, much more extreme than the millennials on the right?
They seem to be. I mean, look, this stuff, like, again, this stuff has been out there forever. When I was an undergrad at Northwestern, I was there when Matthew Hale, and it was his lackey, I think his name was Benjamin Smith or something like that.
Oh yeah.
When he went on the shooting spree, killed Ricky Birdsong in Evanston. Exactly. I was there. That was I think between my freshman and sophomore and junior years. I don't remember which. I think it was maybe between my sophomore and junior year. Matt Hale was out there, and he was very much being a Nazi. Although, honestly, to be perfectly honest, I think, he was maybe he was even tempering some of his public statements a little bit more than Fuentes does. Fuentes is really out there. I mean, he's
now calling for killing Jews.
Yeah.
In speeches. Though.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a lot of, I agree. I think things are becoming more extreme. I mean, look, it's like, it's like the editor of Countercurrent said, it's all about, shifting the Overton window, and as the Overton window, moves right, and as like it becomes like, as it is a mainstream position, it's not universal, but a mainstream position within the Republican Party, that Trump was right to try to overthrow the 2020 election, and that the people who stormed the Capitol were right to do so. If that's moderation, that's within the realm of acceptable discourse. Reasonable people can disagree. Then what's to the right of that? And yeah, I think Gen Z, the Zoomers are kind of volunteering an answer of what's to the right of that.
So what does the future hold, do you think, for the likes of well, let's look at these three: Pedro Gonzalez, Hanania, and Hulkman. Do they all have a lifetime Claremont fellowship in the future?
I don't know, man. If I knew how to predict the future, I'd be living in a much bigger house. Hanania doesn't seem to be paying much of a price, other than getting distanced by Barry Weiss and the University of Boston. He's pretty much, and he's giddy about it, right? He's out there talking about how, like, he's survived his cancellation attempt. I don't know, is he going to get another op-ed in the Times at some point. I don't really know.
Who invites him on for his podcast tour will be very revealing.
Yes. And whether and if his and if the origin of woke gets reviewed in the Times, if it gets a positive review, or the Wall Street Journal, etc. If he's I mean, he'll be on a book tour, like, if he's on CNN, whatever, like that could be. I'm sure he'll be on Fox.
I think Hulkman has been smart to because I
He's
was
laying low.
eagerly awaiting his 30,000 word
Yeah.
essay where he would explain it, but he hasn't. He's just has he just gone silent, except saying he didn't know what the Nazi symbol was to
I
Drake.
guess, yeah. As far as I can tell, he's younger as well. He's like 25. So Hanania has maybe spent a little bit more time in not necessarily the major public spotlight, but he's had enough of a taste of that maybe he also, again, I mean, Hanania knows how much more extreme he can be and how much more extreme he has been. And so he can sort of point to his more recent output and be like, I'm just calling them animals, but I'm not saying that they should be forcibly sterilized. I'm still a good guy. Whereas Hawkman, really stepped in it. Hawkman also got fired. Whereas Hanania doesn't really have anything to get fired from. I don't know the future of any of these guys, and it really ultimately doesn't matter because, they're all to a certain extent replaceable within their movements. I mean, none of these guys are, and this is one of the one thing that I have, again, big fan of Know Your Enemy. Sam Matt are terrific. And I think most of the things they do are great. I didn't love their episode, sort of following up on the Hawkman stuff. I thought it was a little too defensive. Look, I get it. You want to talk to lots of different kinds of people. You're a podcast about the right. It's useful to talk to the right sometimes. Matt came from the right. All of those things are fair, but their idea that Hawkman was this, very promising, very bright. He's not that smart. I read the things he's written. They're not that good. They're easily replaceable. And I don't even know anything about this Pedro Gonzalez guy. And Hanania, he's not that bright. It's a pretty easy sell. Like he can string together coherent sentences as he's calling for the repeal of the Civil Rights Act, or saying that people who are calling for the repeal of the Civil Rights Act it's unrealistic to expect that to happen, but we can just make it so it's essentially a dead letter. That's an argument you can get that from any, from a dozen different people of his political persuasion. So if all of those guys, stop working, and they stop getting published, there will be others to come along.
They'll find another guy who for totally libertarian reasons,
right,
just happens to want to get rid of the Civil Rights Act.
Exactly.
Very passionately.
Exactly.
I just want to end on some of the broader stuff about, we just had this Republican presidential, or this nomination debate without Trump.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that, and sort of let's say Trump dies of a heart attack, what is the trajectory this party's on?
Let's just keep talking about that.
Yeah.
Man. So, all right, a couple different things. You're asking about my predictions for the future, and I don't have any. And one of the reasons I don't have a prediction is because things will go in. There's so many different variables out there that could go in so many different directions, right? I mean, there's a pending lawsuit against Trump right now on the basis of the 14th Amendment. It's at least been filed in federal court that under the 14th Amendment, because he, participated in an insurrection against the U.S. government, he's ineligible to hold high office. That's a good, I think one can definitely make a case about that. If that came through and he wasn't able to run, who the hell knows what would happen, right? Or if he dies of a heart attack. If he does run, would he beat Biden? I don't know. everybody he's a very unpopular. Nikki, she made one very good point she made two very good points during that debate. One was that running on a federal abortion ban is going to lose Republicans every election nationally. I think that's absolutely true. The other one is that Donald Trump is I think she said the least popular politician or the most hated politician in America. It's absolutely true. Like in some ways, him running against Biden, could do Biden some favors. Although with Biden, we've got like an 82-year-old. I mean, I guess he's like a little bit more compos mentis than like your average or basic 82-year-old, but he's old. He's very old, and he's not getting any younger. And I don't know what this election is going to be like. But it really kind of trying to read those political tea leaves. Oh, and the other question about the debate, Vivek Ramaswamy. He's definitely the breakout star. I mean, that debate absolutely confirmed, not that there was really any question, that Ron DeSantis has like the charisma of a decaying phone book. I mean, he's just no one. He's not going to inspire anybody. And so I understand why Ramaswamy came out of that, with the media kind of anointing him and the right commentariat kind of anointing him as, the new number 2 in the race. But Ramaswamy is like 40 points behind Trump, like in the average poll.
It's going to be Trump.
It's going to be Trump. And Ramaswamy is like, I'm sorry, like you can't become the leader of a coalition dominated by white Christian nationalists as a practicing Hindu, not to mention an Indian person. Like, it's just like they're not going to go for. They're not going to go for
Jonathan. If they caught Trump, if the FBI on camera caught Trump laying like explosive devices under a kindergarten tomorrow, I think he would still get the nomination.
I think he would still get the nomination.
I think they would say he was trying to prevent a satanic ceremony.
It was the FBI planted them. There were federal agents involved. It's all fake news. It was AI. The video's AI. No, there's nothing he can do. There's nothing that he can do except if a court of law, like if basically if like the Supreme Court rules it, like with a majority consisting of like Trump appointed justices, rule that Donald Trump is constitutionally ineligible to run for president. That's pretty much the only thing that could keep him from winning having like a point of contesting the presidency and probably winning the Republican nomination. But even then, I think if they did that, like if he still has breath in his body, he would still, try to mount a third party run, and he'd probably still end up with at least 20% of the vote.
So Peter Thiel is worth $7 billion. And it's Mark Andreessen is worth over $1 billion. Elon Musk, who's sort of part of that same crew, over $100 billion. Did I say million? If I said million before, I meant billion.
Yeah.
But Peter Thiel, boy, he just collects these young right wingers like JD Vance, I mean, he has like so many of these guys.
Yeah.
Curtis Yarvin is not that young, but it's like if you're like a right wing crank and these guys like you, I guess they're just gonna support them for life. I mean these are long. This is a longer conversation. We've already had a very long conversation, but the world is becoming in a lot of ways like physically a more extreme place. And part of one of my sort of pet theories, and I think that there's evidence for this, is that like you can't disaggregate this from climate change. From both sort of like the millennial aspects of, like, not millennial in terms of the millennial generation, but the millennial in terms of like apocalyptic, that valence of the word millennial. There's a sense that like, the world might be ending, it might not.
I'm not saying saying that it is. I mean, climate change is a very, very dire threat to civilization and to the species. But just sort of that psychic sense as it exists right now, like in the early 2020s, like it's just kind of driving people crazy, and it's making people more extreme and do more extreme things. The other thing is that, like, in terms of like history, the World War II generation is basically gone. Everybody, the number of people who were even alive, during the Holocaust, and they were, basically babies during it, or young children, we're losing them very quickly.
And Nazism is surging
Yeah.
at the same time. It's no surprise.
And all those things kind of go together. And I don't know if you could have like history is contingent. Like nothing's inevitable. It would be insanity to think that like there was anything inevitable about the Trump 2016 presidential run. But that run was successful, and that we're in the world that we're in now, and that again he tried to overthrow he tried to overthrow the U.S. government in the 2020 election. Like we're really in a space right now where it seems like anything's possible, but at the same time, like I am an eternal and somewhat tactical optimist. We're also in a point where people are talking about new and exciting, hopeful ways of making society better, and addressing climate change and strengthening society. And that's also a thing that's out there in conversation. So, to make guesses, you can't guess. But, in terms of American politics, what happens in the 2024 election, if Trump wins, or if his anointed, MAGA substitute or whatever wins, it does not seem like these guys are going to mellow out at all.
Well, it's good to have a little hope at the end. Before we go, please plug The Racket, and please talk about this great book you just put out before you go.
Sure. The Racket is my newsletter. You can find it at theracket.news. You got to put the in, because somebody else, I won't name him, decided to cop my URL even. So it's theracket.news, but you can find my newsletter there. I write about foreign policy and domestic politics, and a lot lately about Richard Hanania, but that won't be a permanent condition, I hope. And my book that just came out in paperback this month in August. It's called Gangsters of Capitalism: Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. It is about this fascinating guy, a Marine named Smedley Butler, who was, it's a true story. He fought in every overseas invasion, occupation, war that the United States participated in from 1898 until the eve of World War II. He was twice the recipient of the Medal of Honor. But at the end of his life became an anti-war, anti-imperialist activist. And I traveled all over the world, basically talking about the ways in which America's imperial past is forgotten in our country and remembered in other places. And as I was talking about earlier, has this tendency then and now to come back home in the form of fascism. So it's a good book. Check it out.
I'm just curious. The first person I heard Smedley Butler's name from was actually Alex Jones many years ago. Did he try to interview you by any chance?
He did not.
Oh,
and I came. That would have been. I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gone on. But that was one thing about writing about Smedley Butler, is it definitely puts me in proximity to a lot of interesting people and some interesting conversations. I encountered Smedley Butler through Haiti. Because Smedley Butler played a major role in the U.S. Occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934. He was there at the beginning during the original invasion phase. And
I would love to discuss Haiti with you sometime in the future.
Yep.
But because that country really is in dire straits. Right?
It really is. It really is. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It was really a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your reporting now.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.